Madam Speaker. First question to our jury goes to William Bird, who's Media Monitoring Africa Director. William Bird, as Mandisa was suggesting, there are political and commercial interests at play that define what we see in our media space. Is that true?
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that they're not worthy of trust. It's, in the same way as Mandisa has a very clear, deliberate agenda, media have an agenda that's the good ones, at least, that say, here's our code of ethics, we subscribe to these things, and we do it according to these particular values. If people don't like that, there are methods and means of holding them accountable, which you can't say for a number of other sectors.
If you stick to the core values of journalism, accuracy, balance and fairness, you answer the question about whether there are commercial and political interests which will decide whether or not those values are upheld or not.
No, look, just because you're run by a commercial entity, your credibility depends on that. In the same way as where we are now. If ENCA had no credibility over the last couple of years, they would have had no audience, as the SABC discovered and as ANN7 discovered, precisely not because they were offering an alternative narrative that no one wanted, but because they had no credibility. And credibility is determined by the fact that you say, we're not ashamed about the fact that we make money because this is a capitalist society.
But there's a difference between making money and whether that money, the direction in which that money wants to go, influences what you cover and how you cover. Juanita?
But the media is not making that much of money. It could have, that argument could have held up, years ago. The space that we're in now, really, our only jobs is to report the news, and our currency is credibility. We will not have jobs if we were not credible. We will not have jobs if we don't have uncomfortable conversations. That's what you're undermining the public that consumes our news.
The reality is the public feel undermined when you have a whole editorial from an editor of the Sunday Times saying that we believe that there were other influences at play here. There are stories that have been totally discredited. A journalist's currency is their reputation.
Absolutely.
And reputations were annihilated through that.
Absolutely, and this is something that happened a decade ago, and the Sunday Times had to 5 years later come forward and say, we've learned hard lessons from it. And the same way other media houses don't do that. And the difference is our editors and many other good editors, and when ENCA does mistakes and other radio stations make mistakes, it's a matter of saying our currency is credibility. We exist because we have to be credible. Therefore, when we pick up on mistakes, we are the first to come forward and say we've messed up. It served in no interest of the editor of the Sunday Times, let alone the commercial interest of the Sunday Times, to come forward and say, we screwed up on a story that happened.
But don't circulation numbers affected when stories like this come up? But more importantly, Thabo, William, you can pick up on that later. Thabo, to you. There's just more that is needed aside from saying, we're sorry, we made a mistake. When stories have a material impact on people's lives, they affect their careers, whether they get to have a career or not. And it does do an unshakable damage to the public's faith and trust in us.
Without a doubt. And I'm actually quite happy that you mentioned Sunday Times, because they made mistakes years ago. But then again, we see them in the news quite recently, all the years down the line. Similarly, again, making mistakes that have a lasting impact on the livelihood of people. So over and above whether the media is independent or has an agenda, I think they have to be seen to be independent by the public. And that actually adds more to their credibility, which is their currency.
Yeah.
And without that, there's no way in which they can be able to serve the people diligently.
And actually, I want to widen it a little bit, because it's not only about one particular newspaper. We have a range of media provisions in our country, from digital, from online media, to print, to radio, and to television. Cumulatively, Lehlogonolo, what is the impact on brand media South Africa?
As the people that we consuming the news, we feel that we have been robbed, because what the media does every time, it takes certain sides of certain individual, as Mandisa say. For an example, I'll tell you, recently I was listening to Tolani's shows on 702, and a gentleman called Max came through and said, they suggest that they must stop covering EFF events live. What is that? That's obviously that's not what the public wants to know. That's what public wants to know: the truth, the fact, and what happens in the media and what happens around the world and around the country. So,
and it actually leads me to a point. Maybe I can toss back to William and Juanita. You can have a view if you want, and I'll bring it back to our panel about when we talk about media credibility, it's often looked at through the lens of how we do our political reportage. But our stories in South Africa are much more than just political stories insofar as political personalities. They are about policy issues and how they impact people on the ground. Are we getting the balance right, or does it seem, from where you're sitting, there's a fixation with a certain type of coverage and certain people that we cover, extraordinarily more than other stories?
Yeah, I mean, it's the nature of power and how it's reflected in society. So we see more men in the news than we do women. And that's reflection and a recreation of the power dynamics that exist in society. So you'll see a lot more men who speak in the media and who are given authority than you see women, and certainly a lot more wealthy and upper class men and women who speak above the people who are ordinary citizens. We hardly hear from them, and we hardly ever hear from children and young people, right? So that it doesn't mean to say that they're not those glaring gaps in a way that the media itself is structured. But that's a very different point from suggesting that they have some kind of a overt political agenda to go.
Right, so what's responsible for this reality then? Is it just resources, a lack thereof?
No, I mean, it is about the way that the media sector is structured. But there you're talking about some of those mainstream media like ENCA. But if you go down to a small commercial entity or community radio station or a public broadcaster, and our public broadcaster, if they were purely a public broadcaster, then you'd see a lot more of those things, and that's why it's so important.
Go ahead, Juanita, and then Lohanola wants to come back in.
But I also think that, the response and the criticism to the media is basically what they see on TV in prime time and what they see on front pages. People don't go deeper and look at the critical analysis.
How do you know that?
Because things like, the EFF, and we're not covering the EFF. I mean, count the stories, do a critical analysis, see how much of airtime the EFF gets.
You're saying it's equitable then? No. If you're covering political parties, obviously barring what is needed to be covered on a particular news day, there is equitable, unbalanced coverage of everybody in the political space. And
based on news value. And the second point that I want to make is that it's healthy to have this relationship between Mandisa and ourselves, particularly because we can't be singing from the same hymn sheet. It will be bad for democracy if we have to come and say, no, we agree, the media is perfect, we need to upset people like Mandisa, and we need to upset people like the ANC, because that's our jobs.
You want to be upset, Mandisa?
No.
But you are upset because the EFF has named names. It has created, many will agree, an air of intimidation and threat. Journalists feel like, if you come to an EFF news conference, something is going to happen.
That's news to me. Journalists normally seem to enjoy EFF press conferences.
This is, would you agree?
I mean, enjoying is one thing. I'm not talking about the press conferences. I'm just talking about covering of the EFF. It must be uncomfortable for you, as it is. It must be uncomfortable for us if you are praising us. So, and I'm not talking about the EFF particularly. I'm talking about politics.
But let me say something, right, about people feeling that there's some kind of skewed focus on the EFF. You must understand that your job is to cover balanced news. Number one. Two, you must focus on what is maybe not sensational, but at least topical at that point. What is interesting, not rather interesting, what is of interest to the public, what is of usefulness to the public, and what is relevant to them, and what is what you commonly call as newsworthy. Now, it can't be our fault if other people are focusing on things that are not newsworthy. Not that we do only newsworthy stuff. We focus on the truth. We focus on the realities of our society. Our mobilization is on the ground all the time. Therefore, it's always relevant and on point. And therefore, the media finds our content, whether it's political or not, almost always relevant. And so if we are getting skewed coverage and we are seeing it on the other side just because we were boycotted by a few rogue individuals in the media for a week, so if we're not looking at the bright side and seeing that we're actually getting a lot of coverage, we apologize for that. But the reality is that you need to focus on our issues, because we are the only people right now that are focusing on the real job that South Africa needs to be doing.
I'm going to ask you to take a breath on that point. When we come back, I want to put to Kate Skinner whether she agrees that there is a climate of threat and intimidation for journalists in our country today, and whether this comes from, as we've been discussing in our conversation, from an agenda that is set somewhere else other than what a story demands, and whether it demands coverage or not. We'll be back straight after this.